Have you mastered these 4 tricky blouse sewing techniques? Let's unlock them together. Gathering, French seams, burrito roll, and button placket. If you're ready to take your blouse sewing, understanding, and skills to the next level, then keep watching. A quick side note as we begin, if you're here for one of those specific sewing techniques that I just mentioned, especially as you sew your ballad blouse, feel free to skip around to the different parts of the video. I'll include timestamps for each section here and in the description box below. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to master 4 potentially tricky techniques that show up in and can be applied to many different blouse patterns. Not all of these are terribly complicated, but if you are on the newer side of sewing, these spots might get you a little scared, or you just might not totally understand what they are or exactly how to do them. And it's always nice to see a visual. So for each potentially tricky spot, I'm going to rate the trickiness factor from 1 to 10, with 1 being easy and 10 being very hard. And then I'll give you a step-by-step visual of the sewing for that technique, as well as some tips and tricks. The pattern I'm using is the ballad blouse, and this is a classically designed button-up blouse pattern with lots of pretty details. And many of them are optional if you're looking for a super easy sew, or you can opt into some of them for a challenge. So I think learning in general as you sew is, with whatever pattern you're working on, the cool part is that all of those skills and details can totally help you level up for working on other more complicated patterns. It's just all about confidence building and adding to your skill set technique by technique. So whether you're an experienced sewist or just starting out, today you'll learn about gathering, French seams, burrito roll, and button plackets. So let's unlock these techniques together and get sewing. Technique number 1, gathering. Okay, the first potentially tricky technique we're going to discuss is gathering. For confident beginners and experienced sewists, this step is probably so easy that you can do it in just a few seconds and not give it a second thought. But I remember being a newbie and feeling a little perplexed by this step. And gathering of all sorts is found everywhere in woven blouse sewing. When it comes to the difficulty of this step, I'd rank it at about a 2 out of 10. So why do we gather? What does it do for us? Well, it's a technique that accomplishes a lot of different things. It can be purely ornamental. So those folds all squished together look pretty cool. But it can also allow for extra ease in a garment, like when it's used on the yoke and the bodice to allow for more room at the bust without having to install darts. Or it could be used to ease a larger length of fabric together with a smaller length. So like when you have to gather a sleeve head so that you can work the sleeve into the arm side. So for the ballad blouse, there are a couple of spots where gathering is used or it's optional. First, we see gathering at the yoke. This is actually an option within the pattern. The other way to connect these spots is to use something called shearing, which is like on a whole nother level. So gathering at this place accomplishes the same result, and it just is a totally different look than shearing. So today we're going to be gathering the top of the bodice, where we will attach it to the yoke of the ballad blouse. So ballad also uses gathering at the back of the bodice, where it attaches to the yoke as well. And the process of both of these is basically the same. And we also see a version of gathering by using a quick basting stitch, and that's used to attach the sleeves into the arm side evenly. All of these spots are generally done using the same technique, where we sew a couple of rows of basting stitches right around the seam allowance or above it. And basting stitches are basically just like a long stitch length with the thread tails at either end. And you don't want those to be backstitched or to have them secured at all, really, because you want them to glide through the fabric. These threads, like I said, need to glide through that fabric. And really what you're going to be doing is gliding the fabric along those stitches, and it gets the fabric all scrunched up and gathered. So what is hard about gathering? Well, it can be really hard to make that gathering done evenly and distributed evenly along the length of fabric. And if you don't, it can look a little bit unprofessional or maybe even a little bit sloppy. And it can be really frustrating for the gathering to like sort of ungather at either side or to slide back and forth between the spaces when you get the fabric all scrunched up and when you have it ready to finally attach it. So I also know that when it comes to gathering, it can be hard to keep the seam allowance that's above the gathering stitches all pointing in the same direction. And if it gets pointing in different directions, I've had problems in the past where there being like big gaps or like puckers because the fabric isn't all facing the same direction and it doesn't all get caught when it's sewn on. So what is my advice to get pretty and even gathers? Well, I've got just a few tips. Number one, for really long spots of gathering, like where you've got like a really wide skirt and you need to gather that enough to attach to a bodice, I suggest that you try using clear elastic to do your gathering. You'll just stretch the elastic as you sew it to like the skirt that needs to be gathered, and then the elastic will draw up and then you can attach the fabric to the bodice or whatever. It works like a dream. I have another video on how to do that on the channel that you can search for, but that's not a technique that I'd really suggest for ballad. So for ballad and for most of these like small spots of gathering at the yoke and at the sleeves and at the back, my little tip is to just try to glide the fabric instead of pulling on the threads themselves. So don't pull on the threads, glide the fabric. So those threads can easily break if you're pulling on them a lot. So try that. Another strategy I use is to try to mark the middle spot that needs to be gathered before I put in any stitching. So the example would be like the true center back of the piece. And then once I know what that center is, I try to work on and off from both sides of those basting stitching lines. So a little here, a little there, until they look pretty even on both sides. Then I put a clip on everything at the end to keep it in place until I'm ready to use it so it doesn't come undone. And then another thing I do when I'm finally ready to attach those gathering pieces is to pin and clip everything like a lot. And double check that, maybe even triple check that gathered seam allowance fabric is all oriented in the same direction so that there aren't any gaps. So do the attaching on a sewing machine first, I would suggest, and don't try to serge anything until you're sure that like everything is facing the same way. So I'm going to give you a quick visual tutorial here so that you can see the gathering spots on ballad blouse.
All right, so we're going to start with those long tail threads. We're going to pull them out before we even start sewing. And then we're going to stitch with a long basting stitch right in the seam allowance. I like to use a 4.5 length stitch. So after we've got 2 rows of those, then we're going to take it back over to our table and we're going to mark the center. Then we're going to put the other piece of fabric that we're supposed to be lining up this gathering with, align it together so you can see how the centers compare. And then you're going to pull the bobbin thread out and get it ready to be sliding on. So you're going to want to use the bobbin thread for sliding. And that's going to, the focus here is that you hold the bobbin thread steady and you slide the fabric along that bobbin thread. And you're going to work from each side back and forth until it's all gathered in toward the center. So the goal here is to get that gathered fabric to be exactly the same length as in this example, as the yoke piece. Then make sure you pin or clip everything so it stays in place, and then check the seam allowance so that it's all facing the right direction before you stitch first with your sewing machine before you do anything with a serger or an overcast stitch.
Now let's attack technique number 2, French seams. Now the next potentially tricky technique that we're going to discuss is French seams. And again, for a more confident beginner and experienced sewist, this step is very, very easy. But I remember being a newbie and not fully understanding this very common process. So this technique is everywhere in sewing woven blouses, and you're probably going to find it helpful to really understand it. And again, like I said, it's very easy. It just takes a few more lines of sewing. And so that means it's a little bit more time than a regular seam. So when it comes to the difficulty ranking for this step, I would give it a 3 out of 10. So what are French seams and why do we use them? A French seam is a way of sewing seams that gets all parts of the seam allowance completely inside the garment so that you can't see it from the inside or from the front. It's like a way of really neatly finishing woven fabric on the interior without having to use a serger or overcast stitching. In fact, I think it looks better than serging or overcast stitches. Another benefit to French seams is that they can make many seams like a lot more sturdy since there are 2 lines of stitching instead of just 1. So for the ballad blouse, there are a couple of spots where French seams are used, or at least optional. First, we see them on the sides of this blouse. It's a super common way of finishing any woven blouse. And we also see them at the side seams of the sleeve. How is it done? The first step is really the most important one. And that is that we sew whatever seam it is with the wrong sides together first. And I know that seems kind of counterintuitive for a newbie because that leaves like a yucky looking seam allowance on the outside of the garment. Like we wouldn't want that, but we're not going to stop there. We then have to trim that seam allowance and then fold the pieces right sides together, like the right way, with that yucky seam allowance sandwiched inside. And then the next line of stitching will seal it all in there. So if you get such a pretty outcome from a relatively easy process, what is potentially tricky about that? So first, it's easy to forget to do them. And then just out of habit, you put everything right sides together and then you realize that you started them wrong. So take your time when it comes to sewing your blouse and really avoid rushing through. That's just like a general rule. Next, it can be tricky to trim that seam allowance down to the right size. And if you trim way too close accidentally and you make a hole, that is just like the worst feeling. So I recommend using duckbill scissors. I recommend laying everything out on your table for a clear view. And again, take your time. Pressing as you go can also really impact the professional quality of your French seams. I have a few other pieces of advice for French seams, and that is really consider your fabric weight. Most lightweight wovens are fantastic candidates for French seams, but if your fabric is super bulky and thick, you might want to rethink using that technique. And that's why you don't often see this technique with like knit fabrics or really heavy bottom weight fabrics. There are just too many thick layers that will make subsequent sewing steps really hard, or it just might feel uncomfortable to wear with all that extra bulk. Next, make sure that as you sew French seams that you keep your seam gauge handy. You're going to want to measure not only that original seam allowance, but you're also going to want to measure your trimming, and then you're going to want to measure your final seam allowance when you have the fabric right sides together again. So each pattern is going to have unique specifications, but for the ballad blouse, you are going to want to have a 1/4 inch seam allowance for that first wrong sides together seam. Then you're going to trim that to 1/8 of an inch. And then you're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance for the final right sides together seam. So here's a quick visual that you can see for the French seams on ballad blouse.
All right, so to begin, we're going to have everything ready to sew with the shoulder seams connected, and we're going to be sewing with wrong sides together. That feels weird, but we're going to be sewing with wrong sides together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance first. Now we're going to trim that seam allowance from a 1/4 inch to 1/8 of an inch. I like to keep my seam gauge handy to make sure that I get those measurements exactly right. And then we're going to trim. I like using my duckbill scissors, and I also try to make sure I have everything out of the way and nice and clear and straight so that nothing accidentally gets caught up in my scissors. Now that that's trimmed, I'm going to turn the whole thing with right sides together, and then I'm going to press this and I'm going to put it underneath my sewing machine with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then I'm going to end up with this gorgeous interior seam that just looks beautiful.
Now, the next tricky technique that we're going to tackle is the burrito roll. And no, I am not just ready for lunch. The burrito roll is a very common sewing technique for blouses and dresses. Again, for most intermediate and experienced sewists, this step is second nature. But newer sewers are going to want to see maybe a visual of this technique to help them just like wrap their minds around it. When it comes to the difficulty ranking for this step, I'd give it a 5 out of 10, at least for the first time that you do it and practice it. But you can knock off a couple points once you get the hang of it. So what in the world is a burrito roll when it comes to sewing, and why is it useful for sewing blouses? So a burrito roll is a technique that is useful for sewing lined or partially lined bodices. If you take a closer look at the inside finishing for Ballad, you'll see that the yoke is lined. There's 2 layers, back to back. And that gives some extra sturdiness to the shoulders and the neckline. And it's like visually interesting, and it makes the inside finishing look even more professional looking with the shoulder and the back seams all encased. So I suppose theoretically that you could just use one yoke piece, one layer, and just have serged seams on the inside. But that is just not going to give you all the benefits that we just talked about with a partially lined or encased garment. Another way people use burrito roll is to finish off the neckline and arm side of a lined sleeveless garment without having to use armbands or binding for knits or bias tape for wovens. So I have another video that shows an approach for doing the burrito roll on the channel for a cadence dress. Just keep in mind that you could be taking away some of the width around the arm if you're lining your fabric with that approach. So how does a burrito roll work? This is really a technique that needs to be shown step by step visually. So I'll just say right now that the basic approach of this technique is that you're going to get those yoke and lining pieces sewn together with the main body of the blouse rolled up and out of the way. Then we'll pull it out and voila. So before we see that visual, let's just get a few handy tips for doing the burrito roll. Number 1, make sure you understand the right side and wrong side of your fabric, especially as it is shown on the diagrams. So for Love Notions patterns, the wrong side of the fabric is shaded and the right side of the fabric is not shaded in those diagrams. So second, another handy tip is to roll up the main body pieces and clip them with like a big clip. They will cause problems if they get in the way. And this is like that roll part that we're talking about where the name burrito roll comes from. Now, if you were doing like a neckline and arm size for a sleeveless blouse with a burrito roll, you would actually have to roll them up so tight that the whole roll of fabric can fit through a skinny little strap. But with this pattern, with Ballad blouse, you can just get them quickly out of the way. So now I'll show you a visual of this spot for Ballad blouse.
Okay, to begin, we have got the yoke attached to the bottom bodice, and we also have the front pieces clipped to the top of the yoke shoulder on only the main yoke piece, not the lining piece. So what we're going to do is now roll up all of the fabric that's in the main body of the piece. So on both the front and the back, we're going to roll it up and clip it really tight. All right, now the back is done and I'm clipping with one of those big giant wonder clips. I'm going to flip it over and I'm going to do the exact same process for the front pieces. I'm just going to kind of quickly roll them up and connect them to that big roll that I've already got started with the back bodice piece. I'm going to repeat that for both sides. Just kind of, the key here is that we want to keep those shoulder seams accessible. Okay, now that we have both the front and the back rolled up and out of the way, we're gonna get these yoke pieces right sides together. So all of that main body piece is all gonna get wrapped up between the yoke both the lining piece of the yoke and the front piece of the yoke that's got those clips already attaching it to the gathered section of the front yoke. I know it looks like a little bit of a mess right now, but just remember that middle part right there is all got to be nice and tight and out of the way, rolled up, so that you can get those shoulder seams of the yoke pieces to attach together. And now that they're rolled up and I am able to put that yoke piece up, I'm going to attach them, clip them together at the shoulder seams. So now at the shoulder seams, I've actually got 3 layers of fabric. I've got the lining yoke, the main part of the shoulders at the bodice, and then the back yoke piece. And I'm going to sew a line through both of those shoulder pieces, catching all 3 layers of fabric. Okay, so here's what I've got. I have sewn both the shoulder seams, and now I'm just going to pull that roll out. And I know it looks like a mess right now, but if you just pull it all out, everything is beautifully encased. It's kind of like one of those voila moments where it just kind of feels like magic, especially if you're doing a neckline and the arm side. It's just kind of like amazing how this all goes together, and it just makes such a nice, pretty finished product.
And now technique number 4, the button placket. Last but not least, let's look at this technique of installing a button placket on a blouse. So a button placket is just like a cool functional addition to a blouse. Essentially, it means that you can wear the blouse open with like a cami, or you can keep it closed and buttoned to wherever you want it to be. A button placket allows for like access for nursing for mothers, and it lets us get in and out of our blouses without like messing up our hair. It also lets us show off some cute buttons. At its most basic level, a placket is just an extra couple pieces that offer more structure on that center front for installing buttons or buttonholes or snaps. So these strips of fabric are typically interfaced. And that means that they're more sturdy and they're not going to bulk up the rest of the garment, because the rest of the garment's not going to be interfaced. So because of the sturdiness, they can handle the weight of all those like extra doodads and threads and everything hanging off of them. And they can withstand buttonhole sewing, which we all know can be pretty treacherous. We want stable fabric. So because the placket requires more steps, more materials, more time, and a lot more careful sewing, I'm going to rate this as the hardest of the 4 techniques in this video. I'm giving it a 7 out of 10. Of course, once you get more experience, it'll be a lot easier. So how does a placket or like a button placket work at a basic level? Well, all you're going to do is just take a strip or 2 of fabric. You're going to throw some interfacing on it. You're going to attach it to the wrong side to right side around that neckline and opening. And then you're going to fold it over and attach it to the right side. That sounds easy, right? But not so fast. Getting this placket on can throw a couple of challenges at you. So with placket sewing, be on the lookout for 1, uneven, unmatched, or wobbly sewing when you attach it. This, I think the technical term is like wonkiness, but seriously, because it's at the neckline and because both sides need to be perfectly symmetrical and like just so, it can be really easy for like the smallest mistake or skip stitch or slightly off seam allowance to show very, very clearly. Also, when sewing that button placket, be sure to use the right interfacing and avoid scorching your fabric as you adhere them together. Especially with lightweight wovens, it is essential to use the proper interfacing, and like the wrong kind of interfacing can cause like bubbles, or you could lose the adhesive, and then the whole placket can look like a puckery mess after just one wash. And when you're pressing, I highly recommend using a pressing cloth to protect your placket cloth from a too hot iron. If it's not hot enough, the interfacing won't attach, and if it's too hot, the whole thing can be burned beyond repair. So as for attaching the placket, be sure to keep careful track of those seam allowances. And one of the steps for placket sewing before you attach it to anything else on the main body is you want to sew a stitch around the outside of the placket as a guide for folding it over and finishing that side. So don't skip that step, especially for lightweight wovens. It's really, really helpful for slippery, thin fabric to keep everything even. And now here is a step-by-step sewing of the placket for ballad blouse.
We're going to start by preparing the placket by interfacing it, sewing it at the shoulder seams, and then folding up that outer edge of the placket. We've already sewn that line of stitching around the outside of the placket so that we have a guide to do that even easier. So we're going to then pin it or clip it to the inside of the ballad blouse. So we're doing wrong sides to right sides all the way around, being really careful to match everything up. One place to match things up for sure is at the shoulder seams, so the placket shoulder seams as well as the garment's shoulder seams. And also there's kind of like a point at the kind of the front of the ballad blouse where there's like a little, like a corner, like a very gentle slope to it, and you're going to want to make sure that those are matched up really perfectly too. So we're sewing that line of stitching, attaching the placket to the wrong side of the neckline and the opening of the ballad blouse. And then we've got to get this collar ready. So we are going to clip into the curved area so that everything will lay nice and flat. So after we've done that, then we'll be folding the placket all the way around and getting this in a position to be stitched on in a couple different places. Here's a close-up view of what the seam allowance looks like between the right side of the placket and the wrong side of the main garment. One thing that we're going to do here is understitch. So we're going to take that extra seam allowance that we've got and we're going to stitch close to that original seam, catching the main body of the garment. This step is optional, but I think it helps the collar and everything lay flat and keep the underside in. Now that we've understitched, we're going to fold everything back over and we're going to do one line of stitching very close to the edge. I like to do this about 1/4 of an inch away using my foot as a guide. So this will really be my third line of stitching around the placket and we're not even done yet. So I have done the attaching the placket, the understitching, and now I've done just one line around the placket on the front. Next, we'll do the next line. All right, that looks good on the outer edge of the garment. Now we're gonna do the button placket right here as you see it. It's on the left-hand side. We're gonna do basically the exact same thing. Now the tricky part about this area is not here on the front bottom of the garment where it's opening, but really around the neckline area where you've got curves and points and fabric that seems a little bit hard to distribute. Go slow, make sure everything lays flat before you sew it, and tuck all of those pieces of the placket in. Here's what my final product looks like. I have gone ahead and installed my buttonholes, which is a whole nother tricky part of sewing, which we can do a video about at a later time. But for this button placket, I'm super happy with it. I think it looks nice and crisp and clean. And I really just love the way that this piece turned out.
Now, before we wrap up, if you're looking for even more support as you sew, head over to the blog where Katie is showing how you can stabilize your fabric with this very common at-home ingredient. You will never guess what it is. I was shocked. We all know how awful it can be to work with really silky, slippery fabrics, and this secret totally tames them as you sew. So I'll link that blog below too. Anyway, when it comes to blouse sewing, I hope this video has you ready to master and any potentially tricky blouse sewing techniques from gathering to French seams to the burrito roll to plackets. I hope you found this tutorial helpful and that you feel more confident to tackle these techniques on your own. Apply these techniques to your blouse sewing and take a look at the pretty woven blouses that we've got in our pattern shop at lovenotions.com. And especially grab today's Feature Friday pattern, the Ballad Blouse. Keep practicing and you'll soon be a sewing pro. Thanks for watching and happy sewing.